In the last few years, a growing trend in horror has been horror FYING, popular pieces of entertainment that have entered the public domain. This year, we've already seen Popeye's Revenge, released a mere 2 months after the cartoon character entered the public domain. We've also recently seen horror movies based on The Grinch with the Mean One, and most famously, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, which has led to the cinematic Poohniverse. These projects are simply a relatively cheap way for low-budget horror films to be made without having to worry about name recognition. They're also, more often than not, lazy, uninspired, and barely have anything to do with the subject matter they claim to be about. One of the more fascinating questions that came about with Disney's Steamboat Willie entering the public domain in 2024 was both how this usually litigious company would react to their iconic mascot being open to the public, and how it would be utilized now that anyone could theoretically make their own Mickey Mouse movie. No surprise that almost immediately after becoming free to use, Mickey became the star of several no-budget horror films, trailing on the mouse's good name. While we've already had The Mousetrap last year, with a sequel apparently already in the works, this year brings us Screamboat, which at least has slightly more of a horror pedigree behind it. From Stephen LaMorte, director of The Mean One, and starring Terrifier's Art the Clown David Howard Thornton as a murderous Steamboat Willie, Screamboat at least feels somewhat more ambitious than just your standard cash-in, even though that's still clearly what this is. That being said, Screamboat is more proof that this trend needs to stop, or at the very least, more should be done with the property that's being parodied after nearly a century in the public eye. What is Screamboat about? One night on the Staten Island ferry, a long-closed hatch is opened up, which lets loose a murderous mouse. As the ferry launches, the ship soon has its captain murdered, leaving passengers stranded in the water with a maniacal, murderous mouse. Amongst those on the ship is Selena Allison Piddle, a hopeful fashion designer, Pete Jesse Posey, who works on the ship and takes a liking to Selena, and a group of drunk women celebrating one of their birthdays, each of whom looks suspiciously like Disney princesses. These passengers have to find a way back to land, while this mouse causes mayhem, cuts the power, and starts killing this group of humans. Screamboat knows exactly what it is and constantly nods at its audience with extremely blunt references. For example, in the group of drunk Disney princess-inspired birthday celebrators, there's Jazzy Poonam Basu, clearly modeled after Aladdin's Jasmine, who is an influencer showing one of her friends how to do a dance called the Dole Whip. Or there's a sex scene in which a character asks, "Can you feel the love tonight?" Maybe a character is dressed as Peter Pan and nothing is done with that, or an old man who sleeps on the ferry pops in simply to say, "Dead men tell no tales." The humor is at about the level of the Captain America, "I understood that reference" meme, and rarely gets better than that. Screamboat tries to be more than a cash grab, but ultimately fails. But Screamboat does at least try at times, even if it doesn't succeed. Very late in the film, we get a look at the history of this mouse known as Steamboat Willie, and his origins with his friend Walter, but everyone called him Walt, which is told through an animated sequence. In one clever moment, a person says, after 90 years, he's finally out in the public, before stating, everything gets recycled. It's a fun wink, and it's the type of self-awareness in this ludicrous film that Screamboat could have used more of. Yet, like a lot of these public domain horror films, the inclusion of the actual IP seems almost irrelevant. Is this a film that could have been about a bunch of people trapped on a ferry with a killer on the loose, and had absolutely nothing to do with Mickey or Disney? Absolutely. This is a very basic concept written by LaMorte and Matthew Garcia Dunn that people will only be drawn to because of that thin connection to Disney that has been thrown in for marketing purposes. Again, like a lot of these types of horror films, there's plenty of potential in turning a beloved character into a vicious murderer. Screamboat, like many of its contemporaries, is just too lazy to do more than just make exhausting references and casually throw in names of characters, rides, songs, movies without much purpose other than to point out that these things exist. Much like the Terrifier movies, the best part of Screamboat is easily David Howard Thornton, who is going absolutely bonkers as Steamboat Willie. It's an inherently absurd performance, as this murderer is about a fraction of the size of everyone else on the boat, and sure, his voice sounds more like a maniacal Elmo than Mickey Mouse, but it's certainly the most fun aspect of Screamboat. Very few things can improve a modern horror film like Thornton's gleeful killings, and that's certainly the case here. While Mickey Mouse is quite possibly the biggest name to fall into this trend of public domain horror films, Screamboat also proves that no matter how major the brand, these projects are simply going for name recognition and little else. Again, the problem is that these types of films feel lazy and could do so much more with their concepts, and while Screamboat tries to combat that with tame references, winks at the audience, and absurd violence, it can't keep itself afloat. With this version of Mickey Mouse now in the public domain, there should be a whole new world of possibilities for these types of films, but instead, Screamboat goes for the bare necessities and lets all its possibilities go. Screamboat comes to theaters on April 2nd. Give Screamboat a 3/10.